All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling American democracy.
Ooh, a big one.
You've been doing some heavy reading on this.
Definitely.
We've got history, political science, even some philosophy in the mix. It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it really gives you a sense of, like, all the different layers to this, right?
Exactly. But that's why we're here for this deep dive. We're going to try to see the whole picture.
And zoom in on those crucial details, for sure.
So the big question we're grappling with today is American democracy actually in a crisis? And if so, how did we get here?
Big questions.
Huge. And here's something to think about as we start, when you compare the U.S. to other democracies around the world,
Okay.
we actually fall behind in some pretty key areas, especially when it comes to making sure everyone has a fair and equal say.
That's interesting. Not the image we always project, is it?
Not always the shining beacon, right?
Right. Which leads perfectly into what we're talking about today, right? Because even though most Americans, they believe in things like liberty and equality, justice, all those good things.
American dream.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The reality is our system doesn't always live up to those ideals.
Okay, so let's break this down.
Yeah.
When we say American democracy, what are we even talking about?
Well, your reading laid out a pretty clear definition of democracy in general,
Okay.
a system where everyone has equal political power, individual rights are protected, fair representation, decisions made collectively.
Oh, good. Sounds like it's working.
On paper, maybe?
But you're saying we're not quite hitting the mark in the U.S.
Well, think of it this way. We've got this thing called the American political creed, right?
Okay.
These core values of liberty, equality, justice that are supposed to be like woven into the fabric of who we are as a nation.
Woven into our identity.
Exactly. But the thing is, throughout history, certain groups, they've been systematically excluded from those promises.
So, like, there's this gap between the ideal and the reality on the ground.
A big one. A broken promise, almost.
Yeah.
And when you compare us to other democracies, that gap just gets even more obvious. We've struggled with things like voter suppression, unequal representation.
So it's like some people are getting a much bigger slice of that democracy pie,
Definitely.
while others are left fighting over crumbs.
That's a great way to put it. And this brings us to the big, scary question. Is American democracy actually in a crisis?
Okay, deep breaths, everybody.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's the elephant in the room, right? And I kept coming across this term in my reading, democratic backsliding.
Uh-huh.
What is that exactly?
So think of it like a slow erosion, right? It's
Right.
not like a dramatic coup. It's this idea that democracy weakens gradually, almost sneakily.
Kind of under the radar.
Yeah, death by 1,000 cuts.
Okay, so how do we even know if it's happening? What are the signs?
Well, there are some key warning signs, and Levitsky and Ziblatt.
Oh yeah, they wrote the book, How Democracies Die.
Exactly. They highlight some really important things to look out for, like when leaders start rejecting democratic rules. Yeah.
And denying the legitimacy of their opponents.
Basically saying they have no right to even be there.
Exactly. And this can actually create a climate where violence becomes more acceptable.
And that reminds me of, like, the January 6th attack on the Capitol.
Exactly. All those norms of civility and respect, they start to break down.
The things that, actually allow a democracy to function.
Exactly. And these aren't just abstract ideas, right? We see real examples of this backsliding happening right now. Take gerrymandering, for example.
Oh, gerrymandering. Remind me what that is again?
So basically, it's when politicians, they draw these voting district boundaries in a way that gives their own party an unfair advantage.
So they're kind of rigging the system.
It's like cutting up a pizza, so you always get the biggest slice,
Yeah.
even though everyone's supposed to be sharing equally.
Okay, so gerrymandering.
Exactly. Then you've got voter suppression tactics.
Like what kind of things?
Stricter voter ID laws, limiting polling places, putting obstacles in the way, making it harder for certain people to vote.
Exactly. And then on top of all of that, we've got this rising tide of polarization.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one.
Have you noticed how, like, everyone's becoming more and more divided?
Yeah.
Almost like enemies just because they have different political views?
It's like we can't even have a civil conversation anymore.
It's called affective polarization, and it's getting really bad.
It's like everyone's retreating into their own corners.
Yeah.
There's no room for middle ground.
Exactly. And look, these divisions didn't just appear overnight, right?
No.
To really get how we got here, we need to look at the historical roots of American democracy, both the good and the bad.
Yeah, let's go back in time, because this crisis, if it is one, has been brewing for a while, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you can't talk about American democracy without acknowledging the elephant in the room, the legacy of slavery and racial exclusion.
I was reading about that in the Dubois and Clegg pieces.
Yeah. Powerful stuff. And it really shows how these issues continue to shape our political landscape even today.
So even though, slavery was abolished over 150 years ago,
Right.
its impact is still being felt.
Absolutely. And it's not just the past. We also have to look at how our government is structured. Some people argue that the very design of our democracy can actually lead to undemocratic outcomes.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, think about the Electoral College.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about the U.S. falling behind other democracies in terms of representation?
Yeah.
The Electoral College is a big part of that. It's totally possible for a candidate to win the presidency without winning the popular vote.
So wait, the person who gets the most votes doesn't always win.
It's happened, and that means millions of votes essentially don't count.
Wow. That seems, I don't know, kind of messed up.
Right. And then there's the Senate,
Yeah.
where states with smaller populations, they have the same number of senators as states with way bigger populations.
So it's like a tug of war where one
Wow.
side has a much bigger team.
Exactly. And these structural issues, combined with the historical baggage we talked about, they create this system that's not always fair or representative.
This is heavy stuff.
It is.
Is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, the good news is understanding these problems is the first step to finding solutions.
Okay.
And your reading actually offers some paths forward, like reforming the Electoral College or putting term limits on Supreme Court justices.
Interesting.
But before we get into those, there's one more piece of this puzzle I want to bring up.
Oh, okay. I'm all ears. What else is there?
Well, it's this idea of state building from the margins.
Okay.
Basically, throughout history, it's often been the marginalized groups, the people who've been excluded, oppressed.
Yeah.
They've been the driving force for progress.
So you're saying real change doesn't always come from the top down. It comes from those who are fighting for their rights, demanding a better system.
Exactly. Think about the civil rights movement, women's suffrage, the fight for LGBTQ plus equality, all driven by people on the margins refusing to accept the status quo.
That's powerful. So how does this apply to the challenges we're facing today? What can everyday people do to make a difference?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
You just brought up this idea of state building from the margins.
Yeah.
It's kind of inspiring to think about how, marginalized groups have been the ones pushing for positive change in America.
It's true. When you look back at history, I mean, so many advancements in democracy, social justice, they come from the efforts of people who are marginalized, right?
Right.
Like, think about the abolition of slavery,
Uh-huh.
the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement. These were all led by folks who were saying, hey, we need a better system.
It's like real change doesn't always come from the top down.
Exactly.
It comes from the people who are demanding their rights, who are saying enough is enough.
Right. And that's a lesson we can all learn from today, I think. You know, even when things seem kind of bleak, even when all you hear about is how divided everything is, we have to remember we're not powerless. We can all do something to build a stronger democracy.
Okay, I like that. I'm ready to feel empowered. But where do we even begin? How do we take that inspiration and actually do something meaningful?
Well, I think it starts with education. And I don't just mean like formal schooling.
Right.
It's about actively seeking out information, challenging your own assumptions.
That's so important, especially these days when we're bombarded with information.
Oh, yeah. It's easy to get trapped in these echo chambers, surrounded by people who already agree with you.
Totally. And those echo chambers, they can really prevent us from seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to expose ourselves to different viewpoints, especially if they make us uncomfortable.
I've heard that before, that discomfort can actually be a good sign. Like, it means you're growing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, how can we solve these complex issues if we're all stuck in our own little bubbles, refusing to listen to each other?
So education is key. But what about action? How do we go from understanding the problems to actually doing something about them?
Well, there are tons of ways to get involved. It depends on your interests, what you're passionate about.
Right.
You could volunteer with organizations that are working on these issues, whether it's voter registration, campaign finance reform, fighting discrimination.
So find something you care about and then figure out how to use your energy, your skills to support it.
Right. And it doesn't have to be some grand gesture, you know?
Yeah.
Even small actions can make a difference, like talking to your friends, sharing information online, donating to a cause.
And just showing up, like going to local government meetings, writing to your representatives,
All of that sends a message that you're engaged, that you
that
care.
you're paying attention.
Exactly. And that's what democracy needs. It thrives on participation, not just observation.
But, it can be really exhausting, right? There will be setbacks as, times when it feels like nothing is changing
True, progress isn't always a straight line, but even in those moments of frustration, it's important to remember why we're doing this.
because the stakes are high.
They are. The future of our democracy depends on our willingness to engage, to fight for what we believe in.
And to remember that we're all in this together, right? I mean, American democracy isn't some abstract idea. It affects all of us.
It's the foundation of our society, and we all have a role to play in protecting it.
I love that. That's a perfect segue into the last part of our deep dive,
Oh, great.
where we'll talk about some specific things we can all do to make a difference. It's funny, as we've been talking about all these challenges to American democracy, I've realized
Yeah.
we focus so much on the national level, the president, Congress, the Supreme Court,
Yeah, the big stage.
and it can feel kind of overwhelming, like what can one person even do?
Right. It's easy to feel disconnected.
But then I think about it, democracy isn't just happening in Washington, D.C. It's happening right here in our own communities.
Absolutely.
And we've been talking about how everyday people can make a difference.
Yeah,
And this is where it gets really interesting, right?
I think so.
Think about your local school board, your city council.
Your neighborhood association?
These are the folks making decisions about stuff that directly affects your daily life.
Exactly. Education, public safety, parks, roads.
These we actually deal with.
Yeah. And often it's at this local level that you can have the biggest impact.
I've been so guilty of this myself, like getting wrapped up in the national news cycle
Uh-huh.
and forgetting about what's going on right in my own backyard.
Happens to the best of us.
It's like, why am I stressing about what's happening on Capitol Hill
Right.
when I haven't even been to a city council meeting?
Easy to do.
So attending those meetings, speaking up, even just talking to your neighbors about local issues,
All of that matters.
it makes a difference.
Absolutely. It's about making your voice heard where it matters most.
Yeah, because sometimes I feel like, is my one vote even going to make a difference?
Right. You feel lost in the crowd.
But at the local level, it can actually have an impact.
You're not just a face in the crowd anymore.
And this brings us back to that idea of state building from the margins.
Yeah.
It's not just some historical thing. It's happening right now in our own towns and cities.
It's all around us.
So how do we tap into that energy, that spirit of change at the local level?
Well, start by getting informed, right? What are the issues that matter most to you? Who are your elected officials? What do they stand for? Once you know that, you can figure out how to get involved.
And that can mean so many different things.
It could.
Volunteering, going to community meetings, writing letters, organizing a neighborhood event, even just having those conversations with friends and family.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of just showing up, being present.
Right, being an active participant, not just a spectator.
That's how democracy thrives. The more people who get involved, the stronger it becomes.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
We've covered so much ground, from the history of American democracy to the challenges it's facing right now, and most importantly, what we can do to make a difference.
I hope you're feeling inspired.
I am. I really am. And as we wrap up today, we want to leave you with this thought.
Oh, okay.
What will your contribution be? How will you use your voice, your actions, to shape the future of American democracy? Not just on the national stage, but right here, right now, in your own community.
Keep learning, keep questioning, keep engaging.
We're all in this together.
Absolutely. Let's build that brighter future together.